Conjoined twins Eng and Chang Bunker faced constant exploitation. But their final horror show began when Chang fell ill, and one morning Eng woke up to find his brother dead. Still tethered to him, his response was utterly disturbing. Chang and Eng Bunker led extraordinary lives. Born as conjoined twins, they lived in poverty in Siam before coming to the West to be showcased as freaks. And even though they ultimately found success as a famous Siamese twins, it was never easy. They endured great prejudice, exploitation, and an incredible loss of their bodily autonomy. Still, they eventually found their voices and soared up the American social ladder. But at what cost? As one could imagine, the twins' debut into the world was a bit of a shocker. Chang and Eng were born on May 11, 1811 in Siam, which is now Thailand, to their mother Nok and their father, a Chinese fisherman named Ti. Although their mother claimed that their birth wasn't any more laborious than those of her other children, the sight of the twins reportedly horrified the midwives. Distressingly, both Chang and Eng were connected at their sternums by a band of flesh. Even worse, the band was twisted, forcing the infants into a dangerous face-to-face position. Fortunately, while the midwives were presumably busy staring at each other in confusion, Nok's instincts kicked in, and she did something jaw-dropping. In a move that likely saved the twins' lives, she reportedly untwisted their band, which connected to just one umbilical cord, and repositioned the twins so they could instead lay staring into each other's eyes. Still, there were more challenges to come. Nok was adamant that her babies would live regular lives, so as Chang and Eng grew older, she urged them to exercise to try to stretch their connection. And as a result, their band eventually extended just long enough to allow them to walk alongside each other. After that, there was no stopping them. The twins were energetic, happy-go-lucky kids who endlessly ran around and played with their friends. But sadly, the joys of their youth were short-lived. Chang and Eng's carefree childhood all became to an abrupt end when a smallpox epidemic hit their community hard in 1819. Although both boys caught the sickness and miraculously survived, their father, Ti, wasn't nearly as lucky. He died from the illness when they were only 8 years old. Because Ti was the household's breadwinner, Chang and Eng's family struggled financially without him. Unfortunately, their mother's solution to the problem was devastating. You see, shortly after they lost their father, the twins somehow wound up employed in the cocoa bean oil industry. But remember, they were just 8 years old when their dad passed, meaning that by today's standards at least, these poor tykes were working as child laborers. After a few years, Chang and Eng abandoned the oil business to help their mother raise ducks for eggs and travel as merchants. Then, a chance encounter changed their prospects forever. While out for a sunset swim in a river in 1824, the twins accidentally scared the pants off a Scottish merchant named Robert Hunter, who was floating in a fishing boat nearby. At first, the wide-eyed merchant assumed he'd just seen some sort of strange animal swimming in the river. However, Robert quickly realized his mistake upon meeting the conjoined twins and discovering that the boys were actually human after all. Then Robert's previously startled eyes suddenly turned into dollar signs. For Robert, his serendipitous encounter with the conjoined twins must have felt like winning the lottery. Imagine the riches he could fetch with them. Of course, it took Robert almost no effort at all to convince the nearly destitute Chang and Eng of their potential worth. Although Chang and Eng agreed to the too-good-to-be-true proposition straight away, the twins weren't the only ones Robert had to persuade. And naturally, Nok didn't want to let her sons go. To help put everyone's minds at ease, Robert proposed that they all sign a contract, stating that Chang and Eng's tour would be limited to 5 years. Robert also offered Nok $500 to financially compensate for the loss of income she'd have to endure due to the absence of her twins. It did the trick. Feeling more reassured, they all signed the contract together, and then it was a done deal. Eventually, the king of Siam became aware of Chang and Eng's unique existence and immediately forbade them from leaving the country. However, the reason why isn't clear. According to Robert, the king ordered Chang and Eng to remain in Siam because he ultimately intended to execute them. It took Robert and his American sea captain partner, Abel Coffin, 5 long years to persuade the monarch. On April 1, 1829, Chang and Eng, now 17 years old, finally boarded a trading vessel to Boston, Massachusetts. Though the trip was grueling, 138 days to be exact, the twins kept busy along the way by learning English, and when they finally landed on August 16th, they were in for a shock. They arrived to a media storm intent on hyping them up. It all started the very next day when the Boston Patriot reported that the conjoined twins would probably be exhibited to the public. A lot of the articles viewed the twins through a sensationalized and, well, prejudiced lens. In fact, most of the articles were wrought with ethnic stereotypes and even outright lies about them. Robert and Abel promptly hired a manager named James W. Hale to help get the twins' exhibit going. Before long, American gawkers could gaze upon the wonder that was the Siamese double boys from mere 25 cents, though Chang and Eng actually preferred to be called the Siamese youths. James even ensured that pamphlets or drawings of the twins would be available for their audiences to purchase as souvenirs. Excitingly, their show started to gain traction. However, it wasn't exactly in good taste. Apparently, someone at some point lost sight of the fact that it was Chang and Eng's conjoined status, and not their ethnicity, that was supposed to be their primary audience poll. Regardless, the show seemed to be purposely exploit and capitalize on the twins' Asian background by dressing them in Oriental garb and styling their hair into pigtails to accentuate their exoticness. For 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, Chang and Eng displayed themselves as public curiosities at various theaters and venues across the United States. Although showcasing their physical connection always remained a key feature of their exhibit, the duo soon took to performing parlor tricks, acrobatics, and feats of strength. Unique as they were, Chang and Eng became an instant hit. Following the success of their show, Chang and Eng quickly drew the medical community's attention. Before long, some of the greatest doctors in America began gathering to see the twins for themselves, and upon realizing that the brothers were the real deal, they begged for permission to examine them. The doctors were practically drooling over Chang and Eng because at the time, few conjoined twins ever survived into adulthood. Yet here they were, the shiniest of medical marvels. With their connecting band, now approximately the size of a child's arm, Eng stood at 5.2 tall, while Chang, who was attached to Eng's left arm from their perspective, was an inch shorter than his brother and wore lifts in his shoes to keep from pulling Eng down. Even though Chang and Eng earned a profit from all their performances, Abel Coffins supposedly once boasted to a group of people that he and Robert Hunter owned them, thereby signaling that he probably didn't care very much about the twins' personal rights and freedoms. Especially since, as it turned out, the doctor's offers actually piqued his interest for one majorly selfish reason. The twins' handlers wanted to use the medical community's seal of approval to bolster the show even further. Such ringing medical endorsements came at the expense of the twins' bodily autonomy. In time, Chang and Eng grew so popular that their handlers decided to take their show overseas. In 1830, the twins set sail to meet their British audiences and also, unfortunately, meet with British doctors. Nevertheless, their trip was a success, and by the time they returned to New York in March of 1831, they turned a large profit. By this point, the twins were older, wealthier, and much more experienced in the biz, and they were finally starting to find their voices. Whether that factored into what happened next is unclear, but one thing remains for certain. Chang and Eng's initial supporter, Robert Hunter, called it quits. He sold his portion of the show to Abel Coffin and then walked away for good. It was the beginning of a downward spiral for the twins. That summer, while out for a hunting retreat with their manager, a group of more than a dozen local men randomly approached Chang and Eng, believing that the men were there to mock and imitate him. The situation quickly flew out of hand when one of the twins suddenly used the butt of their firearm to hit a man named Elbridge Geary. Elbridge responded by grabbing a large rock and heaving it toward the twins, hitting one of them in the head. With one twin now bleeding, Chang and Eng fired back at him with their weapon, though thankfully their shot turned out to be a blank. Even so, it was enough to scare the locals. They scattered. Somehow, the media caught wind of the brawl between the twins and the townspeople, with the sale of mercury and other news outlets initially characterizing Chang and Eng as the victims, but Elbridge Geary wasn't having it. 2 weeks after the incident, Elbridge penned an open letter titled, "To the Public," that got published in the press, claiming it was the twins, not him, who'd started the fight. When their manager at the time learned that the incident could potentially tarnish the twins' prestige, the consequences were devastating. He hit the roof and quit. Fortunately, James's successor turned out to be his friend, Charles Harris, whom he could advise with all sorts of helpful hints. As Chang and Eng struggled to deal with the fallout from their last incident, a whole new controversy erupted. In the middle of a performance in Alabama, yet another physician demanded that Chang and Eng Bunker allow him to examine their connecting band. But this time, Chang and Eng said no. Rather than respecting Chang and Eng's wishes, the doctor became enraged and screamed, "You are all a bunch of pickpockets and imposters." He then incited an uproar, causing audience members to throw things at the twins from across the room. Once again, the twins were in hot water. Officials needed someone to blame for the mayhem, and it wasn't about to be the jolly old doctor. Chang and Eng's rapid exit off the stage made them appear extremely guilty in the eyes of the law. So for the second time that year, the twins wound up paying a good behavior bond. Then, just like after the last incident, yet another close relationship of theirs broke down. Abel Coffin frequently traveled, leaving his wife Susan responsible for the twins, and Susan was a total nightmare. In fact, Susan rapidly became a source of great distress for the twins, as she tended to neglect their needs, even rejecting their pleas for an extra $3 a week so they could afford to feed their horse. Growing desperate, Chang and Eng eventually begged their manager, Charles Harris, to intervene, hoping that he'd write letters to Susan on their behalf. After some initial reluctance, Charles finally agreed. Still, his letters didn't help for one blood-boiling reason. Even though Chang and Eng perceived their business with the Coffins as a partnership of equals, the Coffins only ever saw the twins as their subordinates. Indeed, the Coffins forced the twins to perform when they were unwell, care for Susan whenever Abel was away, and once, while traveling, the Coffins even booked the twins into steerage as servants and lied to their faces about it. Needless to say, Chang and Eng were utterly miserable, so they began plotting their exit strategy. Because Abel once guaranteed the twins could be their own men, when they turned 21, Chang and Eng became 100% determined to be free of the Coffins forever the moment they reached adulthood. But there was a problem. Abel had set sail for Asia in 1831, with plans to come back to America in January, and he still hadn't yet returned by the time the twins' 21st birthday rolled around in May. So, desperate for their freedom, Chang and Eng took drastic measures. Increasingly anxious at the thought that if Abel never came back, they'd be stuck working for the Coffins forever, Chang and Eng decided to split, rather unceremoniously. As a result, when Abel Coffin finally did return to Massachusetts, in July of 1832, it shocked him to his core to learn that Chang and Eng had left. With his prized cash cows on the run, Abel went nuts. He even falsely accused the twins' former manager, James Hale, of exciting his subjects to rebellion, which I doubt James appreciated. After a frantic search, Abel eventually located the twins in New York, where he supposedly found them gambling and drinking. Abel confessed to James that when he finally found Chang and Eng, he flew into a disturbing rage. He proceeded to give them the biggest thrashing they had ever had in their lives, which definitely isn't the way to go when you're trying to win your friends back. Sure enough, the twins refused to return with Abel. Interestingly, Abel later downplayed the entire encounter with the twins in the letter to his wife, writing, "We had much talk. They seemed to feel themselves quite free from me." And free they were. Now that Chang and Eng had finally regained control of their lives, they could finally run their show the way they wanted. In a bit of a shake-up, they contracted their own crew, began dressing in American attire, and they even took to conversing with their audiences in English. Perhaps most tellingly, they stopped presenting themselves as boys, and instead began referring to themselves as the Siamese twins. Chang and Eng met their neighbors, the Yates family, shortly after establishing their farm, and their gaze quickly fell on two of the Yates daughters, Sarah and Adelaide. While Sarah was allegedly the simple and more fair one, Adelaide, who excelled in personal beauty, was younger, taller, and thinner than Sarah, and was also said to have more refined taste. To Chang and Eng, it seemed like a match made in heaven. But alas, love can be complicated. The Bunkers' courtship of the Yates sisters was unusually dramatic, because both Chang and Eng fell in love with Sarah, tossing poor Adelaide aside to kick rocks. Of course, despite their unique circumstance, the two brothers couldn't possibly marry the same woman. So Chang eventually settled for Adelaide. Or maybe Sarah just liked Eng better, who knows? Either way, the twins soon announced their intentions to wed. The happy couples declared their intent to marry by riding in an open wagon together. It should have been the happiest moment of their lives. But instead, it turned into a nightmare. The media insulted them, the entire town flew into a tizzy, and a few local men even went as far as to shatter the Yates windows the night before the wedding. They even threatened to destroy the Yates crops if Sarah and Adelaide's father refused to manage his daughters. It must have felt like the world was against them, but it didn't matter. On April 13, 1843, Chang and Eng Bunker married Adelaide and Sarah Yates. While they all shared a home at first, and a colossal bed, the twins eventually built two separate houses for the respective families and traded off between them every 3 days. As a whole, the number of Chang and Eng's children could have filled an entire classroom. Their first babies arrived just 6 days apart, with Sarah giving birth on February 10, 1844, and then Adelaide on February 16th. Chang and Adelaide had 10 children together, while Eng and Sarah had 11. Chang and Eng both had huge families to support, and despite their many business ventures, it started to look more and more like that have to come out of their semi-retirement from the exhibition industry. So, the twins resumed touring and eventually featured their own children in their acts. They also scored a brief contract with P.T. Barnum, which undoubtedly gave them a nice boost as well. Chang and Eng quickly found themselves in dire straits when the Civil War ended in 1865. A lot of their money was in Confederate currency, which was now worthless. For exclusive perks like early access to new videos, priority replies to your comments, and to have your say on future content, consider becoming a Factinate member. On top of that, your support helps keep the channel going. Click the link in the description for more details. Now suddenly, down a good chunk of their money and unable to run their farmland alone, the twins would again have to showcase themselves as freaks to make ends meet. At this time, they were just two elderly men with large families to support. Needless to say, their performance didn't elicit a whole lot of compassion from the crowds. Then, to make matters even worse, the unthinkable happened. Unhappy, Chang promptly took to drinking heavily. Then, 4 years later, Chang's health deteriorated even further when he caught bronchitis in January of 1874. Concerned, their doctor advised the twins to remain indoors to allow Chang to heal. Except, the twins had an agreement to switch houses every 3 days. On January 15th, the Bunker brothers made the trek through the wintry cold from Chang's house to Eng's house. Sadly, it was a fatal mistake. Though Chang's health appeared to improve the next day, his breathing had become so much more difficult by the evening that the twins had to spend the night resting upright in a chair by the fireplace. However, this was uncomfortable for Eng, who was having trouble sleeping, so he requested that they return to their bed. Then, the following morning, one of Eng's sons woke him with the devastating news. Chang had died, and, understandably, Eng panicked. Upon hearing the horrifying news that his twin brother was gone, Eng's response was heartbreaking. He cried, "Then I am going." And for the next hour, he suffered in great agony and misery. He broke into a cold sweat, and at one point he even moved Chang's body to be closer to him. Although the family quickly sent for a doctor, Eng died on January 17th, a little over 2 hours after Chang passed. They were 62. But still, the brothers couldn't be left in peace. The public demanded an autopsy after learning of Chang and Eng's passing. And the autopsy results, while scientifically fascinating, were also incredibly heartbreaking. While the autopsy results revealed various facts about the twins' condition, including that they shared a liver through their connecting band, they also disclosed what ultimately ended their lives. Distressingly, the examination showed that while Chang passed from a cerebral blood clot, Eng's subsequent demise wasn't actually the result of any physical ailment. Despite alternate theories, Eng likely passed from the brutally intense shock of having his worst nightmare realized, remaining connected to his deceased twin brother. What a horrible way to go. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.